Welcome everybody. I am Eti Terem, Chair of Jewish, Islamic and Middle East Studies. Thank you all for attending this important event on the roots of Hamas's attack on October 7 and the subsequent Israel-Hamas war in Gaza. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our three panelists, Abdelmunem Said Ali, Shai Feldman, and Khalil Shikaki, the founding team of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. I will start with Abdelmunem. Abdelmunem Said Ali is a professor of political science and the chairman of the board and CEO of El Masri El Yaum publishing house in Cairo. He served as president of El Ahram Center for Political and Strategic Studies in Cairo. He was a research fellow at both Brookings Institution and the Belfer Center at Harvard University. In 2014, he founded the Gulf Arab State Institute in Washington. He served as a senator in the Egyptian Shura Council. He is a founding senior fellow at the Crown Center. Shai Feldman is chair of Israeli Politics and Society at the Crown Center and professor of politics at Brandeis. From 2005 to 2019, he was the founder and director of the Crown Center. From 1997 to 2005, he served as head of Tel Aviv University's Yaffe Center for Strategic Studies. Since 1997, he has served as board associate of Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. From 2001 to 2003, he served as a member of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters. Last but not least, Khalil Shikaki is a professor of political science. He has directed the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in Ramallah since 2000. A world-renowned expert on Palestinian public opinion, he has conducted more than 100 polls among Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip since 1993. He taught at several Palestinian and American universities, including El Najah and Birzeit universities in the West Bank. He too is a founding senior fellow at the Crown Center. Now we are done with the formalities. The Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University was founded in 2005, and from its inception, the Arab-Israeli conflict has been a central research topic for its founders. The results of their collaboration include a unique team-taught course and a textbook based on their teaching experience entitled Arabs and Israelis, Conflict and Peacemaking in the Middle East. This is required reading for anyone who wants to understand the Arab-Israeli conflict in complex and nuanced ways. What makes this book stand out is the decision of its authors to explain the conflict from the perspective of competing narratives, the Israeli, Palestinian, and the Arab ones, based on rigorous research and balanced analysis. Today, we celebrate with them another career milestone, the publication of their new monograph, Arabs and Israelis from October 7 to Peacemaking, the most recent collaborative effort to understand what happened on and since October 7. More broadly, in their teaching and research, Abdelmunem, Shai, and Khalil model empathy, respectful conduct, and an intellectual temperament conducive to fruitful academic exchanges about challenging issues, especially during polarizing times. As a lifelong student of the Middle East myself, I have been inspired time and again by their intellectual and personal conduct.
It's downhill from here.
Our event today will be divided into two parts. First, For about 40 minutes, our distinguished panelists will address 3 fundamental questions. Number 1, what led to Hamas's attack on October 7? Number 2, what happened during the 15 months since that date as Israel responded by launching a war to eliminate Hamas in Gaza? And number 3, under what conditions could a political resolution be possible? The panelists will address these questions from three perspectives: the international global system, the regional context, and domestic politics. The second part of the event, which will last about 40 minutes, will be devoted to Q&A from the audience. Capiche? Are we together? Before turning things over to the panelists, I want to acknowledge the generous financial support and assistance I have received from many departments, programs, and colleagues. I thank Academic Affairs, the Project for the Study of Liberal Democracy, and the Interdisciplinary Program in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics for providing generous, and I mean generous, funding. I am grateful to support provided by the Departments of History, International Studies, Philosophy, and Politics and Law. My thanks too to the Spence Wilson Center for Interdisciplinary Humanities for assistance. I owe special thanks to Professors Dan Cullen, Erin Dolgoy, Rebecca Tuvel, and Steve Wirls, who have been invaluable collaborators. I would also like to gratefully acknowledge Laurie Yearwood for her help on several occasions. Finally, I owe the greatest thank you to Laura Jacobson, a top-notch administrative assistant and multitasker with whom I have shared most of the work on this event. She played an indispensable role in bringing it about. Thank you all. And we are ready to start. We are late as is. We have a monumental task in front of us. We are starting with Khalil opening remarks.
Thank you, Eddie. My opening remarks are not about any particular topic. It's about us, the three of us, why we are here, and why we wrote this monograph. And the monograph, the title says, October 7 and Peacemaking. So there's a crisis and there's an attempt on our part to address it. How do you make sure that perhaps this is the last one? That's our attempt to be constructive in a place where it is difficult for one to put himself or herself in that position. The three of us have been working together for 30 to 40 years. We have 3 qualities that made it possible for us to do what we do. Although this is called peacemaking, we are not peaceniks necessarily. Some of us might be, but we are all political scientists, and this is a lot more important than anything else. So we're not idealists, we're actually realists. We come from the realist school of thought in political science. And the book that we wrote is essentially an attempt to understand the dichotomy, the conflict, and there is a great deal of examples. We've looked at the last 120 years in order to understand why all of these eruptions of violence took place in the Arab-Israeli relations and the Palestinian-Jewish relations. The reason we look into that is because we want to understand how to prevent that in the future. Mm-hmm. But we also look at the eruption of peace, the successes during the last 50 years where it was possible for Palestinians and Israelis, Arabs and Israelis to reach certain accommodation, sometimes even peace. So in doing so, we've learned a lot about the dynamics that lead to war and the dynamics that lead to peace. And you're right, we look at the international system, we look and the regional system, we look at the domestic environment, but we also look at the role of leaders. Sometimes the individual, the leader, is extremely important in contributing one way or the other, whether it is war or peacemaking. The third thing that we share, which is what we put in the monograph, is we did not create October the 7th, but we wanted to take advantage of October the 7th, because if you look at chapter 13 of the book, chapter 13 of the book basically says, what have we learned? 120 years, so what did we as scholars learn from studying the 120 years? What would it take for Arabs and Israelis, Palestinians and Israelis to end this conflict? If you read that chapter, you come to certain conclusions. We wanted to put those conclusions on October the 7th dynamics to see whether it is possible for us to come up with a plan that might lead to the end of the conflict. What gives us the ability to do that? Scholars and academics, what makes academic knowledge instrumental in peacemaking? It is not our academic knowledge that we bring to the table, but rather our own history in second-track negotiations. I can't reveal everything that we have done together in the past, but we were involved in one way or the other, particularly Shai and I, in leading teams of Palestinians and Israelis with the participation of others, sometimes Americans, sometimes others, in an effort to address a crisis. I'll give you just one example. When the second Intifada erupted, we put two teams, a Palestinian and an Israeli, in order to try and see what can be done to bring the second Intifada to an end. Second track means we do this in consultation, working in coordination, cooperation with our leaders. So our leaders, whether it's the Israel Prime Minister or the Palestinian President, are the ones who entrusted this issue to us. They asked us to go, so that they asked us rather than they did it themselves, to maintain deniability. So we can do the dirty work, and if we're successful, we can present them with our findings.
And then they'll take credit.
If they want to. In this case, they did not want to. But throughout the last 40 years, in addition to our academic background and the research we've done on the book and the entire history of the conflict, this is what we have been doing. And so the combination of realism, the understanding of the conflict and the dynamics in the history of the conflict, and our own personal experience in second-track negotiations gave us the ability, perhaps, to try and attempt to find a solution that we think works, doable, despite the fact that a lot of you reading it might say, okay, so these are idealists who think they can change the world. The real world, of course, is different, and there is no chance that this is doable. We think, if you think that, we of course understand that, and we would fully appreciate the environment that leads you to that. Nonetheless, we still think that what we are proposing is essentially the only sustainable solution to the conflict. We can think about any other solutions to the conflict. None of them are going to be sustainable. What we are proposing, we believe, again, based on everything we have done so far, that this is the only way we can come to a sustainable conclusion.
Okay. Thank you. And with that, we are starting with the first question. And the first question is, what led to October 7? Why did it happen? And I'm starting with you, Abdul Munaim.
Well, thank you very much, Eti, and thank you all. Actually, see you make me optimistic. I mean, the search for knowledge that you put to us today by looking at the book and taking it give me satisfaction of we are not doing something in vain. Well, we have a war here that continued for about 15 months with a lot of bloodshed and all dramatic things you can imagine in wars. It was real. And one of the things that's common between the three of us, we were also fighters. I mean, we served
Speak
in
about yourself.
our
I was
armies.
never a fighter.
Well, you are
Two out of three.
two of us in an organized armies. That is in 1973 war, which was also, having a great impact on the future of the conflict afterwards. So I am actually taking the lead on the issue of the regional factors in the phenomenon of war here. But I admit from the beginning that for wars there is probably you can find 1,000 reasons. But one of them is the regional situation in the region, because the region is really dynamic more than people from abroad here in the United States or Europe or look at it. It's changing, and the change was from people like you. It started all with the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring in the Middle East was started in Tunisia, then Cairo, then Syria, and almost all the states of the region.
2010.
2010 and continued until almost 2013, 14. It's really started by the youth. Youth want to change the status quo. Most of the regimes were ossified, frozen, either in monarchies or in republicans. And the idea of topple regimes actually blinded the youth of knowing what to do next. What's after? Well, they succeeded. Then, of course, there was always organized factors, which was represented by the Muslim Brothers in Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, and all the places, Yemen. And these were guys who knows what they want to do. I mean, in Tahrir Square, with the spark of the Arab Spring in Egypt, immediately after the youth were there, the Muslim Brothers were hiring every apartment around the square in order to make a space for getting food, people if they want to have some rest. So they organized the whole thing and then started to look taking power. The Arab Spring made, elevated the boiling that was happening in Arab societies, but into a region to ask where we are going to go. Obviously, at least it was obvious to me and others, and a majority of population in Egypt in particular, that we became a nation state, not to have a religious state. And therefore, there was another revolution that happened in 30th of June, 2013, and toppled the rule of the Muslim Brothers. After that, I will say that with only the youth still there simmering, looking for a repeat of the Arab Spring, and the Islamists who want to prevail, but also there is a third trend. There is something wrong with us. Yeah, because we can look at the East and look at, usually most of countries in the Middle East look across the Mediterranean. So that is a geopolitical reality. That's from where the colonizers came, but the ideas also came. Most of Arab modernization depended on students like you going to Europe, coming back with knowledge and creating modern hospitals, schools, and markets, and so forth. So that is that kind of a change looked at this time on the East. The experience of Asia after the Vietnam War was quite inspiring. Inspiring in a sense that countries like Korea, which was almost dismantled completely, more than, if you look at the picture, is similar to you have seen regarding Gaza, and also in Vietnam, and also in most of countries like Cambodia, like Laos. And there was, in most of these countries, rebellious communist parties that created havoc in these countries. But after the end of the Vietnam War, the withdrawal of the Americans, these people started to say, hey, let us start to build our countries. And they started to build, and we know now about the Asian tigers and leopards and how they are now are a storage of the biggest economic development that we have in the world today. That kind of an idea of Lee Kuan Yew and the leaders of Southeast Asia really inspired that we got to do this. And that's what make a trend, I will call it reformist one. And reformist in terms of trying to create a serious nation state that's based on equality between men and women, between Christians and Muslims and Jews. And in this case is to start a modern state. The modern state do a number of things. It emphasizes identity, and therefore the idea from where, what put us to be Saudis together, or Emiratis, or Egyptians don't have that much because already they are earlier nation states since the early 19th century. But this idea also meant to penetrate the region of the country. Most of these countries get the space, but it's not quite exploited, it's not quite invested in, it's not really developed in terms of industrialization, agriculture, whatever kind of the creation of that, what I will call it, penetration of the region, was essential to build the state. I will say the mobilization of resources of every country. Every country discovered in itself its human and physical kind of resources that are immense than they can imagine. The only thing to create a system like the one in Southeast Asia, and in different degrees, because socialism was still recent also. However, the change started to take place. I will say about 9 Arab states went into that direction. The one direction are the Gulf states, Egypt, Jordan, and Morocco. These countries really include countries who already made peace with Israel, like Egypt, Jordan, and United Arab Emirates, Bahrain. So these countries actually started to look at the entire region that we have to settle, the conflicts that's there. It's not only the conflict regarding the Arab-Israeli one. We have a civil war in Sudan, we have a civil war in Yemen, civil war in Syria. The stabilization of the region was very necessary. But many of the non-state actors who are all taking the deal of fighting Israel because of the Palestinian question became a very important one. And on the other hand, it was necessary in order to deal with that, a total deal should happen between Arabs and Israelis, integrating the Israelis into the other non-Jewish Middle East, and creating enough ties that allow them to be like, I used to say usually the example between the United States and Canada of interdependence that will prevent more war from happening. For some reason, I will stop that now. Yeah. Can I have a couple sentences for that?
Yes.
Because I am talking about 22 countries plus Israel, so 23 countries. So a little bit. I will say that exactly the reason of the war come from this exactly. This kind of moving from geopolitics to geoeconomics was necessitating a normalization between Saudi Arabia and the rest of the countries with Israel, and that was faced by Iran and Hamas and other, non-state actors that well armed decided to disrupt the deal from happening. That was the beginning on October 7th. That does not prevent us from looking the root causes that came before that. The book treated that in an efficient way, that what triggered it was a regional one, and the solution to it is a regional one, making the deal alive again of the exchanges that I talked about.
Thank you, Abdul Munem. Shai, do you want to pick up where...
Yeah. So what I'm going to try to do is give you like a CNN version of how we got there. Usually you don't have time for more than 2 points in CNN, but I'll do 8. And to say, okay, clearly the basic reason that we found ourselves in this horror on October 7 is that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was not resolved. So what I'll try to do is just give you a sense of, and that had impact on, for example, Israeli domestic politics, which resulted in what I would call Israeli contribution, or Israel's contribution, to create the environment, unfortunately, that also played a role in October 7. So when I look at this, and to some extent also, this proposal that is the kind of where we lead to in this booklet is an attempt also to answer, which I won't now, we'll leave that for future interchanges between us, but also answers the issue of, so what went wrong? After all, it's now been 32 years since Oslo, since the famous Oslo Accords, which were the last, I would say, heroic effort bilaterally by Israelis and Palestinians to solve the conflict, and the conflict has not been resolved. Without which, of course, you cannot understand October 7. So how do we get to this point? How did we get from 1993 to October of last year? So again, the first milestone is Oslo. And Oslo was when Oslo was signed, there were great, fantastic hopes by Israelis and Palestinians and Arabs around and other countries of this monumental breakthrough. Because remember, Oslo was an agreement that was signed between the Israeli government and the PLO. And before Oslo, the PLO was considered by Israel a terrorist group. And then at Oslo, Israel and the PLO signed an agreement on a process. It didn't solve the problem. It wasn't a proposal to solve the conflict. It was an agreement on a process that was going to lead to the resolution of the conflict. Now, one point about Oslo. When the Oslo agreement was signed, even before the PLO came to Palestine, when Arafat returned from Tunis to Palestine, senior Israeli security officials traveled to Tunis, where he was still stationed, and warned him of one thing. They said to him, the principle of a state is that a state, the administration of a state has to have monopoly over over the coercive means. You cannot have 16 different polices and 14 different armies and so on. There has to be one police, one army. It also has to do with Zionist history and Israeli history in the beginning. I won't get into that. But they warned him because, of course, they knew that Hamas was already against this, and they warned him against let the situation continue. But unfortunately, he did not heed the advice, and Hamas was there, and Hamas expressed its opposition by beginning terrorist attacks already in 1996, which led, by the way, to Netanyahu's come to power. The right-wing reaction to the disappointment of Oslo brought Netanyahu to power in 1996. That's the first milestone. The second was the Camp David negotiations in July of 2000, which was the next monumental effort by Israelis and Palestinians to resolve the conflict. And this failed. And I won't get into why it failed, but I will just say it's not just that the efforts failed, but there are two things that we need to know about this. Number one is it was immediately followed in a press conference by the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, who was the convener of this conference, who basically attacked or stipulated that Arafat, the Palestinian side, is responsible for the failure. That's the first point you need to know about Camp David. Secondly, you need to know about it is that just like Oslo, the Israeli side in Camp David, as the Israeli side in Oslo, was led by the peaceniks. The Labour Party was still in power, and the Labour Party once again failed. And it's the labor leaders, and this is so important to understand, the problem why this begins now to tilt Israeli politics to the right is that the Israeli leaders of the center and center left were the ones who said their conclusion from the failure of Camp David is Israel doesn't have a partner for peace. So that created another step in the environment that allowed the right to prevail.
And last one.
And maybe the last one. The last one, and the last one is, of course, the second Palestinian Intifada, which was extremely violent, which led to then Israelis said to themselves, what do we do here with this violence? Apparently there's no peace to be talked about, so Israel needs a sheriff. So they elected a sheriff, a prime minister by the name of Sharon, whose fame was as a fighter against terrorism, which is the reason, by the way, the Bush administration, after 9/11, relied on his advice in the war on terror that came after 9/11.
Okay. So if I'm taking a minute just to try to orient everyone here, Abdel Munaim is talking about a move from geopolitics to geoeconomics in the region, meaning countries, nation states are interested or motivated by economic or practical or pragmatic concerns and finding a way to negotiate agreements with Israel, and by that meaning marginalizing the Palestinian issue and really coming to peace agreements or some kind of agreements with Israel while not solving at the same time the conflict itself. That's the geoeconomics parameter.
Point number 5.
And Shai is adding the actual failure of all these agreements and all these negotiations, the bilateral between Palestinians and Israelis to solve the conflict. Okay, so we are in the regional sphere or in the regional scene, we are moving toward recognizing Israel, signing peace agreements with Israel, signing economic agreements with Israel, and marginalizing the Palestinian issue. And in the Palestinian-Israeli issue, we are just not solving the conflict itself. Khalil, the Palestinian side, or the Palestinian aspect that contributed to October 7.
Okay, but first, let me just...
Unruly.
I will limit myself to whatever minutes you give me. First, on the regional side, it is not just a turn to geoeconomics. but rather the rise of a major regional threat that made it possible for these Arab countries to look at Israel as a potential ally. That is this is not geoeconomics. This is geopolitics. This is strategic thinking on the part of the major Arab countries that saw the rise of the Iranian threat. Without the rise of the Iranian threat, it would not have been possible for these Arab countries to begin to see Israel as a potential ally, thereby threatening the Palestinians. Immediately, once that happened, the Palestinians saw nothing but betrayal, abandonment. The region was their back, was their support. Now it disappeared. It created a sense that Palestinians must take action by themselves to protect their own interests. They can no longer rely on the Arab Peace Initiative, which has now been flipped around and its logic was gone. Secondly, on the Israeli side, it is not a coincidence that the government in Israel on October the 7th was one of the most national religious Zionist government, one of the most extreme in the entire history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. That is not a coincidence. That is the threat emanating from Israel for the Palestinians. The perception is that the conflict, which, as Shai indicated, started to mellow at the signing of Oslo. Now the Palestinians are seeing those religious, national, Zionist forces wanting essentially to take the entire land for themselves. The conflict is no longer over setting borders, but rather existential. The threat is to the mere existence of the Palestinian people. Okay, so these are my two comments on my colleagues. Now turning to the Palestinian side. These are essentially three failures. The failure of the Palestinians in state building. The Palestinians failed miserably to create strong public institutions to govern themselves. That's the failure that Shai started with. Remember, Shai indicating that the Palestinians must have, the PLO must have a monopoly over coercive force. They failed in doing that. Why did they fail in doing that? I'll come to that in a minute. But that is one major reason for where we are today. The second was the split. Of course, all of this comes together due to the failure in state building. The split between Hamas and Fatah, Islamist, secular nationalist, Gaza, West Bank. That split creating an environment in which Hamas had control over Gaza and had to find a way to govern it. And in that, Hamas found it was very, very difficult for it to manage that. We'll come to that in a minute. The third is that this Palestinian Authority that was created, that was confronted by the failure of state building, lost its legitimacy, gradually lost its legitimacy, its credibility. It was seen by the Palestinian public as corrupt, authoritarian, having absolutely no legitimacy. These are the three main factors, but keep in mind that when Oslo was signed, a peace process was started. That peace process created state building. If that peace process failed, then state building was going to fail. There was absolutely no way that the Palestinian effort at state building and everything that I described, the three failures on the Palestinian side, this would inevitably happen if peacemaking failed. And peacemaking failed. Why did it fail? Because the Palestinians believed that Oslo was about ending their violence in return for Israel ending its occupation. But from day one after Oslo, the Palestinians saw that Israel was building settlements right in the heartland of where their future state is going to be. How could they trust the intentions of the Israelis from that moment on? Why are you building a settlement in my backyard? If eventually you are going to leave, you are telling me you're going to leave it to me, and this is going to be my state. And now you're building settlements. Why on earth are you doing that? That created that environment in which the issue that Shai raised again, monopoly over coercive force. If you are Arafat and you are now looking at the other side, building settlements in your backyard, you promised end of violence. But the other side also promised end of occupation. But that side is actually consolidating occupation. Can you allow yourself then to completely abandon the tools that force the other side to sit down with you, which is the ability to inflict pain and suffering on the other side? It was the first intifada that forced the Israelis to sit down with the PLO, and now the PLO essentially abandoned armed struggle violence. And if Israel wasn't going to comply with the requirements of ending occupation for ending violence, then the entire state building structure would collapse.
Okay, so I'm adding, again, just to orient you, I'm adding the Palestinian side to the conversation. So Khalil is talking about the failure of the Palestinians in the process of state building. He's talking about three main issues in that failure. Number one, monopoly on violence. Number two, the split between
The absence of monopoly.
the absence of monopoly, the fact that many groups were armed and many groups took the law into their hands.
Among them, Hamas, the most important, dominating.
And jihad, and Islamic jihad, and yes, but Hamas, absolutely. Number two, the split between Hamas and the PLO or the PA, the Palestinian Authority. And number three, the lost legitimacy of the PA, of the Palestinian Authority, the government of the Palestinians.
Thereby losing the support of the Palestinian public.
Alrighty, we are moving into the second question, and I know you probably have millions of questions. We can ask all of them in the Q&A. I'm moving to the war that came after October 7th. In response to October 7th, Israel launched a massive ground maneuver into Gaza with the intention to destroy Hamas in Gaza. My question is, there are unique characteristics to this war. What would you say are the unique characteristics of this war? What are the unique dynamics in this war? Khalil?
Thank you, Eddie. There is, of course, in the entire Arab-Israel conflict, a lot of periods in which a lot of civilians suffered. There is, however, nothing to compare what happened in the past with what has happened in this war. Similarly for the Israelis, October the 7th witnessed one of the most brutal, vicious attacks in which atrocities were committed against Israeli civilians. This had very serious consequences. When the Israelis saw the atrocities, when Palestinians every day for 15 months saw thousands of Palestinian women and children being killed and maimed in front of themselves with live, on Al Jazeera. 82% of the Palestinians watch Al Jazeera. These scenes for both sides, for Israeli Jews and for Palestinians, created very, very damaging dynamics. The amount of dehumanization that resulted out of that dynamic is unprecedented. I've been doing surveys among Palestinians and Israelis since 2000. So for 25 years, I've looked at how Palestinians and Israelis responded to all these developments since the Second Intifada. But I have never seen the level of dehumanization, mutual dehumanization, that I have seen after October the 7th. This dehumanization and then the change in the narrative, the narratives of both sides about the nature of the conflict. What is it that the other side wants? Israeli Jews asked themselves about October the 7th, and what was their conclusion? Genocide. This is what the Palestinians are after. Similarly, when we ask the Palestinians, what is Israel trying to do in Gaza? The answer is genocide and ethnic cleansing. That narrative had very serious consequences to the issues that we're looking at. And these issues are, do you want to make peace with these people? Of course not. Do you trust these people? Of course not. Whose land is this? Ours, of course. Does the other side have any part of it? Absolutely none. These are the dynamics that were unleashed during this war that has impacted Palestinians and Israelis in a very, very devastating way. Now, does this mean that this is the end? We are not going to see Israelis and Palestinians making peace? Our conclusion in this monograph is of course not.
Yeah.
But I'll leave that to another question.
To
of yours.
another question. Shai, dynamics, the unique characteristics of the war?
I think what needs to be really understood, and I think Khalil kind of hinted at that, is that the debate in many ways, the debate between the center and center-left and the right, and the gradual relative strength of the right wing, because of developments that we've skipped, because we stopped at point 3, is resulted in the fact that debate continued unresolved, and to about a year and a half before October 7. And then during that year and a half before October 7, the Israeli society was split by a different debate that had little to do with the future relations with Israel and the Palestinians and so on. That the right wing, by that point, felt strong enough to try to essentially change something was called the judicial revolution, but it's kind of a misnomer. The reality was that it was an effort to change the balance of power within Israel's democracy between the various governmental institutions at the, I would say, to the advantage of the executive and the legislature at the expense of the judiciary. Now, that was seen as a threat to Israeli democracy. This was not about peace and war. It was seen as a threat to Israeli democracy and brought the pro-democratic forces in Israel to the street, hundreds of thousands of people every Saturday, for months and months and months and months and months. That contributed to the answer to the first question, not to the second, because it created a situation in which the other side, whoever that other side was, whether it was Hamas or the broader picture of the axis, the anti-Iranian, the pro-Iranian axis, which included both Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and so on and so forth, so what in American language is called the window of opportunity. And so they thought Israel was weak. Part of that struggle was a threat by Israeli reservists who were angry about this effort to change the balance of power in Israeli democracy, threatened not to serve, and that created this window. Now, the effect of October 7 was that it ended for a while, or at least much lowered that debate. It essentially created a situation in which in America, in American English is called rally around the flag. Israelis united in this notion that, as Khalil hinted, October 7 reminded them, with the butchery of October 7, of the Holocaust. They thought, oh, once again, Israel faces an existential threat, and we'll put everything aside, and we have to eradicate those who perpetrated this. Not unlike what happened here after September 11, except for the fact that 1,200 Israelis butchered, children and women and everything. You have to multiply this by 30 to get to what it meant in this country, because that's what the population ratios are. So it's waking up one morning, and all this within 24, 36 hours. So imagine, because we all remember what the reaction here. The reaction here to 9/11 was to go all the way to first Afghanistan and then to go to Iraq and not stop. until Al-Qaeda was destroyed. So the Israeli reaction to this attack was very similar to the American reaction to 9/11. We have to go to those who perpetrated that, and we have to eradicate them. And on that score, there has been national unity. Those who were two of the most important parties in the Israeli opposition joined the government, and they only left a few months ago. That was the Israeli reaction. And because Israel suffered that magnitude of atrocities and casualties, it created a notion in which let's also try to do this and not maximize casualties to us, to Israelis, who've already suffered what they suffered in the first 36 hours. That meant also that when you're fighting to look for a military arm of a terrorist organization within a highly dense population, it's not going to be pretty, and it wasn't pretty. And to some extent, I think that what we see now is also a realization on both parties, that, including other Arab countries, that you don't want to see a repeat of that. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, the horrors, both of October 7 and of what happened after October 7, now essentially invited the third question, which is, what can we do about it?
All righty. So again, just to try and orient us, in terms of what we see on October 7 and in the war that ensued, we see from the perspectives of the Israelis and the Palestinians a kind of an existential conflict. After many years that it was not existential conflict, the two sides understand the conflict as existential and changing the narrative in sense of becoming a binary narrative. It's either you or me from both sides. Israelis immediately after October 7th and the horrors of October 7th mobilized the country, mobilized that kind of agreement around how we need to operate, what we need to do. In the side of the Palestinians, seeing the horrors of the war itself is mobilizing the Palestinians. And now we are in a place where the conflict became black or white. I mean, binary. Yes. Abdelmunem?
But.
Yeah. All are these the points that I want to say, but now I will emphasize this point because I feel that we are a little bit became captivated by the events and not really looking at the bigger picture. The bigger picture is the conflict was very complex. It started from the top. We have a nuclear problem, not an easy problem between Iran and the United States. So we have here actors that became very involved in the war because they have that kind of a conflict that's related to global and regional balance, power balance. And that was affecting what Iran did with non-governmental organizations, armed ones that Iran established as a kind of what they call it, advanced defense in case of attack of the United States. And then the involvement of the United States that gave Israel huge support. Huge support. I don't know of any other conflict in the world in which there was deployed three carrier, deployed big, fish with ships with planes and participating heavily in really guiding, the process of Israel in the war itself. So the balance here was really started to be shaky and make us forget the original issue, which is, do we really want to keep that going as in the future? The more you see reasons, you find them reasonable. And in the same time, the more you neglect ones, you think that's a lot of vacuum still here, but all related to the idea of conflict. You cannot bypass that every peace treaty that happened between Egypt and Israel, Jordan and Israel, United Arab Emirates and Israel, related to the Palestinian issue. It was a good chapter in the Camp David of Egypt that related what to do with the Palestinian issue. It was about creating something called autonomy. And then after that, because of also the idea of lack of separation between politics and arms, related every opportunity was really lost. Another opportunity was all attempts in the 1990s to get together with Israel, which was starting like flourishing thing at the beginning after the Madrid conference, but yet after a while also Hamas did the same thing. That's unforgivable. That's not just that. Tell us when we see Hamas and we see Javez and Smotrich, that is the idea of having nation states in the region that really does not allow for religious persons who use holy books as a kind and fighting weapon in that conflict. That will make it perpetuating for the next generations that we will have. Therefore, we have a complex matter that I will postpone when we start talking, about the future, that we need much more than just the conflict itself. Societies got to start to change. Without the change of the societies in getting that life is much better than death and prosperity is much better than poverty, that's, I think, the key in which say why the longevity of the conflict is happening, because each stage like feeding the next one.
Yeah, thank you. Our last question, I know that we are running out of time, but I have to ask this question. We are going to be very short and to the point. What is the vision for political settlement and why now? What is different in this moment that makes you believe that this is a moment where this kind of vision for settlement can work this time? Khalil.
What we are proposing is to make October the 7th and the Gaza war the last war. We do realize that the conflict is indeed becoming existential. And that its impact is not just on Israeli-Palestinian relations, but in the entire region, perhaps even in the entire world. There is debate whether the rule-based international system exists anymore. And so these are very serious questions. And the Arab-Israeli conflict and this October the 7th and the Gaza war therefore give us the incentive to try and resolve the conflict. And we think a two-state solution remains the most important tool available to us to bring about a sustainable end to the conflict and permanent peace.
Okay, so we are talking about two-state solution. This number one, this is our vision, your vision. Number two, why now? Shai, take it.
Are you sure you're not a senior officer in the Israeli Armed Forces? Under disguise here in Memphis? Why now? Because, well, first of all, why now in contrast to before?
Right.
Okay. In contrast to before, because the before had three inherent causes of failure. The first one was that all the efforts were bilateral efforts, were Israeli-Palestinian bilateral efforts. And this conflict is not bilateral. This conflict is a regional conflict. Arabs, Muslims have a stake in places, the most hypersensitive of which is Jerusalem. That already became a battleground in the internal Palestinian, where violence was resulted from a competition between Hamas and others to prove who is the better guardian of Jerusalem. That just shows that, and Jerusalem, of course, the Saudis have a say in Jerusalem, and the Jordanians have a say in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not a bilateral Israeli-Palestinian. When it came up in Jerusalem, in Camp David, some of the Arab leaders reminded Arafat that he has no legitimacy dealing about Jerusalem because it's also an Arab issue. Okay, so number one is the fact that the conflict is not bilateral. It is multilateral. The second thing is that none of these discussions and none of the creative thought that went into finding a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict dealt seriously with the issue of how do you persuade the publics, the Israelis and the Palestinians, to accept the compromises that need to be taken in order to actually implement the solution. So if you wish from the field of business, you would say it did not come with a marketing strategy. Okay? Even the best of these efforts, like the Geneva, what is called the Geneva Initiative, that's 400 pages of actual solution, except for one thing. There was no strategy of how to sell it domestically, not among the Palestinians, not among the Israelis. Yeah. The third reason for the failures, time and time again, is that the third party, in which case the most important and robust third party is the United States of America, the President of the United States, and presidents of the United States tried once and twice and three times with the best of intentions. President Clinton erased 13 years of a president's calendar to be at Camp David physically with the negotiators. There's only one problem with President of the United States to now, which is they actually were very, very, very reluctant to exercise what we would call leverage, to actually use leverage on the protagonists, in this case the Palestinians and Israelis, to get them to agree on something. Mm-hmm. Now, like it or not, the current President of the United States, the new President of the United States, actually doesn't mind using leverage. Now,
on the wrong side.
I'm not going to get into this issue of on what issues and how and so on and so forth, but at least using leverage is not foreign to him. That's one thing that I would say. And secondly, you know, like the rest of the world, we all struggle with this question of, is there logic in what appears to be in Washington, D.C., complete madness? And I say, as we try to look for opportunities for peace, let's also try to see whether there are cracks here and there, whether there's something positive that can come out of there. And I will stick my neck out to say that even in these days, in these hours, where in Washington, D.C., they feel that every 30 minutes the world changed, okay, there is some logic in this, what seems to be a madness. Because if the fruit is too high in reaching Israeli-Palestinian peace, in these 31 years proved to be too high, there is some logic in shaking the tree and asking the fruits and seeing the fruits fall and saying, well, wait a minute, you know, maybe we can do something with these fruits that fall. The reality, for example, is that Egypt is now coming up with proposals for dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Gaza. Excuse me, you can ask about this, why now? Yeah. Why now? Part of the answer of why now was that the President of the United States comes up with a completely crazy idea, okay? Yeah. And then, but he also quietly, whispering, he says, okay, you don't like it? Come up with a better plan. And guess what? They're beginning to come up with a better plan. Okay. Those regionals that have not been involved, that let the children play among themselves without intervention, okay? Well, what's proven is the children can't solve it themselves.
All right, correct. Okay, I want to open the floor to questions, but before that, again, what we are hearing here is that the solution, according to the three, is a two-state solution, nothing else. we are hearing three, in previous agreements or in previous negotiations, three aspects were not on the table or were not dealt with the way they should have been dealt with. Number one, the Israeli-Palestinian.
Don't go. I did the negative. Turn it into the prescription. The prescription is heavy involvement by the region. Okay.
Exactly. So it has to be a multilateral agreement.
Thinking through the details of marketing, which is in the monograph.
Exactly.
And third, think about the exercise of leverage.
Okay. So it has to be a multilateral agreement. It has to be a multilateral effort, number one. Number two, we need to convince the domestic scene in Israel and in Palestine to sell them that kind of peace treaty or a peace agreement. And number three and last one, the US or the EU, they have to
exercise leverage.
Exercise their leverage. All righty, people, we did it. I'm opening the floor to your questions. Students first, ask short and to the point questions. I'm listening. We are listening. We are eager to get your questions. Please.
Why were past U.S. presidents so reluctant to exercise leverage?
Okay, the question is, just to make sure that everyone hears the question, why previous U.S. presidents were reluctant to use their leverage?
I think, to be fair, I think because the Arab-Israeli conflict, there's a book by a colleague of ours, a professor from UCLA by the name of Steve Spiegel, and he called it the other Arab-Israeli conflict, by which he meant the conflict in the U.S. about the Arab-Israeli conflict. So this really differs. This is really what differs this conflict from almost every other international conference that the United States is involved in. The Arab-Israeli conflict has become a domestic conflict in the U.S. So, I mean, that's the answer. Basically, that's the answer. We can elaborate this, and Etty will get a heart attack. So we're not going there. Yeah. Okay. The answer is it's a complicated domestic issue.
There's enough pro-Israel lobby in this country that made it impossible for previous U.S. administrations to exercise that leverage. And if leverage was not going to be exercised against Israel, then it would also not be exercised against Palestinians and others. That meant the U.S. was basically unable to use the great leverage it could have used because of that. And therefore, it left it to the parties to make all kinds of mistakes.
In defense of the United States, in every issue, there is an internal war in the United States. There is the other war of the Cold War, there is the other war of China, and there is the other war of the Arab-Israeli thing. That's a big country.
The China war has no domestic lobby.
Yeah. Yeah, that will take from me and given the time to Khalil after that. The one thing I want to say is the United States practiced leverage. That's when there was a serious regional initiative. When Sadat went to Jerusalem, he really put the whole public opinion in Israel and the United States into the magic of the situation, and from there we started to make the first peace that we have. If we started also the same with King Hussein and Jordan, and even also with Oslo agreement, the United States was there to tight the screws into every progress that happened. What didn't happen, and the United States got confused when it was into a new struggle with terrorism in the world and religious terrorism, and therefore we are becoming even into something that shared with everybody, because we have terrorism and everybody, and even Muslim countries, the people killed by terrorism are more than 90% of those Muslims. So anyway, here the United States shouldn't or should, that's something related to American people. But the duty is a regional one, and the Palestinian one, and the Israeli one. Unless we realize that the issue always is domestic basically because of the failure and the upbidding of every faction of the other people. Therefore, I will say that is what we should talk about, how to make, that's why in our talking, we are trying to propose a reform of Palestinian as a political actor, and also a reform of Israel, what Israel do, and also a reform of the region, because the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is not the only conflict that we have in the Middle East. Trying to stabilize the region in order to go ahead in the issue of creating nation states is really a start from inside every country.
Okay, so Abdel Munim's point is really, really important. In order to get to the point of a two-state solution, the three authors are talking about a period of transition where the PA, the Palestinian Authority, is going to be reformed. Israel's government or Israel's policy towards the Palestinians and towards the conflict needs to be reformed. And lastly, the region, in the regions, Arab countries needs to rethink.
Oh no, it doesn't have to rethink. It's got to be deployed. It's got to be deployed.
They have to become a member.
Because the deal is for Israel to completely and totally withdraw from Gaza. But the problem right now is Israel needs somebody to give the keys to. And there is nobody to give the keys to at the moment.
Okay.
Other than Hamas, you mean?
Other than Hamas. Yeah. So now you see the beginning of a serious conversation. I'm still talking about the fruits that came from shaking the tree.
Yes.
And here we go back to this issue of the leverage. The fact of the matter is, this deal that we have now, the ceasefire, how shaky it is, doesn't matter. That deal was on the table since last April. Last April. The question is, and this is where the leverage comes in, why did we have it? Because this president comes in before he even is inaugurated, and he tells the Israelis and the Palestinians, if you don't reach an agreement by the time I am sworn in, the gates of hell will open. And leave it to you to interpret what that means. That's called leverage.
Yes. All righty. Yes, please.
So let's say an agreement is found, right? And then how does the Palestinian government, what's their sort of plan for Hamas after they reach that agreement?
Very good question.
Take it to you, Hamas is yours.
There are two issues involved with Hamas. One is its continued control over Gaza. That control over Gaza wasn't just the result of the split, but it was also the result of a determined policy on the part of Israel. The Netanyahu government has helped to sustain.
That's point number 6, which he was not allowed to discuss here.
To help sustain that control. So the first thing is, how do we find a replacement for Hamas's control over Gaza? And what would be the price of doing that? Hamas isn't going to say, oh, of course, you're welcome, you can replace us. Secondly, what do we do about Hamas's arms? Hamas has had an army, and now it does still have a strong residual military force that is going to be able to prevent the Israelis from sitting comfortably in Gaza, and it will prevent anybody else, including the US, if this president decides he wants to take Gaza and he wants to send American soldiers, they will have to face Hamas as well. So what do we do about disarming Hamas? What do we do about replacing Hamas? The answer is we need a transitional Palestinian government that is non-political. That is, it's neither Fatah nor Hamas. The Palestinian public, by a large majority, is in favor of such a transitional government that is a technocratic government with a strong prime minister, but it is one that is arrived at through agreement between Hamas, Fatah, and the major Palestinian political forces. Two, we need to disarm Hamas. And the only way that we see feasible for disarming Hamas is by providing a vision for a two-state solution, that we are putting our, opening the door to ending Israeli occupation, building permanent peace along the lines of a two-state solution in which there would be no no political parties that have militias or armed wings. In that context, we would be able, therefore, we needed to have a transitional government. We need to have a vision for ending the conflict along the lines of a two-state solution. With these two tools in mind, we would be able, therefore, to address the Hamas question in its two dimensions: governance over Gaza and how to replace it there, and how to disarm Hamas.
Can I just give you a sense of the Israeli approach to this? Because, because this has not been negotiated yet. The Israelis are a little bit more skeptical. And I think that certainly during the transition, that's where the heavy involvement of the outsiders, especially the Arab countries, would be essential. Where I think I disagree at least a little bit with Khalil, is about the role of the two-state solution regarding that specific question that you asked. Why? Because, first of all, we agree, and I think this is the common denominator of all of us in stipulating what needs to be done here, is that the common approach is the two-state solution. And the importance of the two-state solution in the sense that people will, when considering different steps, will have an idea of what the end state will be. Because right now, Oslo never did that. It couldn't have done it. It only agreed on the process. The end state was never promised. So we agree that the end state, the basis of everything, has to be the two-state solution. What I still find, and I think Israelis are a little skeptical about, is what is the role of the two-state solution regarding that specific question of the disarming of Hamas and so on and so forth. Because Hamas existed and exercised terrorism to prevent a two-state solution. The first failure of the Oslo process, which is the terrorist attacks of 1996, that brought Netanyahu to power, it was after Rabin's assassination. Peres was the interim prime minister, and February and March of 1996 was a stream of Hamas terrorist attacks with one purpose in mind, which is to prevent a two-state solution. So to make somehow Hamas the agents of the two-state solution and say that's also, a requirement for disarming them, I say I don't buy it. Israelis don't buy it. To find Israelis that would buy it is very, very, very difficult. Israel, by the way, in Israel's history, Israel went through the same period. The reason why the Israeli security guys went to Tunis to try to persuade Arafat is because the issue of how do you deal with secondary movements that have armed people was central to the creation of the Jewish state. Because there were the Israeli side's terrorists in the form of Etzel and Lehi. They were not the mainstream, but they were armed groups. And when the state began to be created, they continued to bring arms to them. Ben-Gurion decided there would be one army called the Israeli Defense Forces, and everybody had to show up to be members of the Israeli Defense Forces. These guys started to try to smuggle weapons for themselves, for these new. And Israel, in a situation where it was first surrounded by all the Arab countries, weak, facing an existential threat, the decision of Ben-Gurion was to sink the boat. To sink the boat that brought these weapons to the Jewish side, but to the wrong side among the Jewish side. Okay, so he went as far as that. This was the best example of how central in his concept was this issue of monopoly of force. He was willing to kill and to sink this boat of weapons that was precious in a situation where Arafat ran away from that. The Palestinians, this is not going to be pretty. There is no way to do this pretty, unless Hamas has some kind of a new leader that would understand that it would be good for Hamas.
Okay.
I'll tell you why Shai is wrong. And he actually explained.
You waited an hour.
He explained why he is wrong. Think about it. He tells us that Hamas was fighting Oslo because Oslo was leading to a two-state solution. In my view, this is absolute nonsense. Why?
Oh, Khalil,
he said it.
Khalil.
Why did
Now
he-
you're using language we never used until now. I'm going to take the monograph back.
Why did he? You said it. You said
What you said is nonsense?
no. Oslo did not promise a two-state solution. You said that.
Yeah.
Oslo did not promise a two-state solution.
But they were still worried that it will lead to two-state.
No, Hamas fought the Oslo not because Oslo was leading to a two-state solution. That's the nonsense about Oslo and the two-state solution. It's not about what Shai was saying. There was no agreement on a two-state solution. The majority of the Palestinians who supported Oslo didn't like that part, including Hamas. That part gave Hamas believed Oslo was about consolidating the Israeli occupation rather than ending it. The decision by Hamas that it will sabotage Oslo was not based on the belief that by sabotaging Oslo, Hamas was sabotaging the two-state solution, but rather that Hamas was sabotaging the failure of the Palestinian nationalists to end the Israeli occupation.
Okay, we have 4. All righty, Jaden, let's go.
My question was, how does your proposed two-state solution ensure a future of economic viability for Palestinians?
Okay, we will collect. Okay, we have 4 questions. Economic viability.
We won't remember all of them. I have a one-sentence answer, and we'll deal with this. The region will deal with that. The region has the capacity. The Saudis, the Gulfies, and so on and so forth. Remember that we're talking now about a situation where there is a core of countries that already have signed peace agreements with Israel, and the Saudis are almost there too. And these are countries that have huge capabilities. I mean, if you talk about the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco, we'll be fine.
Okay.
And they will be fine.
Please.
And it's not nonsense.
So,
Yes.
in a two-state solution where Hamas is disarmed, what guarantee is there that Israel will deal fairly with the Palestinians?
Say it again. Ask
What will
again.
be the guarantees that Israel will
Deal fairly with the Palestinians.
Okay.
And not continue to settle.
Okay, so
There's one.
yes,
What would
guarantee.
What would guarantee that Israel will comply with the agreement, and so that the Palestinians can be sure that, in fact, the promises will be implemented? Is that okay?
Yes, specifically if Hamas is disarmed.
Yes. Okay. This is the second question. The third question. I'm coming.
My question is about the Oslo agreement. Was at any point Hamas invited with the Israeli administration and the PLO to discuss with them, or were they completely excluded in all discussions?
Okay. So Hamas in Oslo. What was the role of Hamas, if at all?
Why are we at a point where we can only hand the keys, or where Israel can only, quote unquote, hand the keys over to Hamas and not the Palestinian Authority?
Very good question. Okay, we can talk about the Palestinian Authority. Benjamin?
Yeah, kind of in a similar vein, how does a two-state solution function after so many years of animosity?
Okay. Okay. All righty. Let's do it.
I am.
You didn't hear.
No, I heard everything, and I want to answer it.
Let's do it. Abdel Munem.
Because now the two parties start fighting, so
you are right. You are right.
Well, guys, the Arab-Israeli conflict is a very shitty situation. Sorry for the word. Yeah, it is full of sins, a lot of sins. There is original sins everywhere. Sometimes it's not related to the region and to the Palestinian or Israelis. You know, all the anti-Semitism in Europe and the Holocaust and the Nakba was really a result of failures of, periods past us. If you want to think of the future, what's really, and that's when we were working the book, we tried how people can really approach each other, and I advise you to read chapter 5 and 6, in which we address how the mechanics of trying to surpass a period of lack of confidence. But the most dangerous thing that I'm not sure that we made enough treatment of it is the increasing religiosity of the conflict. I mean, that is the most dangerous one. Therefore, I am for, it is not the issue Hamas was supporting Oslo or not. Actually, it was obvious that for the first time in history, the Palestinians got a political authority over a piece of land. And by the way, for those you, is it viable or not? Every state can be viable. If Singapore can be viable and very viable, every other space can make a state and be viable. So that's not an issue, actually. The issue is for Hamas not to be in the game again, particularly if it has arms. Because in any way, they will always have a score to settle. Exactly like Gaver and Smotrich and other people in the Israeli side who are in the same way even attacking units of the Israeli forces. A situation that like the one that Ben Gurion faced before, but Netanyahu is not facing it now. That is how to isolate them, how to delegitimize them. My call in my country and in our area is Hamas got to be delegitimized to be party in this process. They can leave their arms and stay, as a political actor or because they don't have a project for Palestine as a political and economic and social unit. They have something related to the book. Exactly like Mr. Ben-Gvir, he has something related to the book. The book was fine thousands of years ago. I mean, and we cannot, of course, keep talking about that. That can take us to the hell in the day after. So, so that is so far as this is there. I don't think. I hope that the coming Arab Summit will contribute an Arab solution for this. It is, as Shai said, to shake. We have been shaking the tree for a long time. But yet there was always, when we approach a step that's really we can approach the idea of peace and implement it. We shouldn't forget we have about 50 years almost of peace between Israel and Egypt. And I will say the same between Jordan and Israel. The Israel and the Palestinians and Jordan are members of something called the East Mediterranean Gas Forum, something like the beginning of the EU when they started around the steel and coal to unify Europe. And that is happening, and it can be implemented in North Red Sea area, in which if you went to Taba and looked from Saladin Citadel there to the area, you see the Saudis and the Jordanians. And the Saudis came into that process was really partially because of the Iranian factor. That was true. And if I had time, I would have referred to it. And it is still there. That's something still there. Iran, the periphery of the region, are using the conflict as a source of weakness of the region. Iran is trying. Turkey now supported, the change that's happening now in Syria, and Israel now it's time that to see if Israel came from everywhere. Israel is in order to create a dream in this land. Will it be good to have it almost always in a constant state of fear and readiness to fighting? Making the compromise with the Palestinian is about the time. But unfortunately, because we are too late, even Israel now became really part of the Middle East because they have started religious extremism is affecting the balance in the cabinet and deciding what to be done.
Okay. Khalil, last remark.
When Oslo was signed in 1993, if you take the 1993 to 2000, when the Second Intifada erupted, you will find that the Palestinian economy grew on average by about 4 to 6% increase. Of course, then the Second Intifada came and all of that was lost. The World Bank, about a decade ago, issued a report indicating that if the Palestinians have access to their own resources in the West Bank, this would generate for the Palestinians $5 billion annually into their economy. The entire amount of assistance that the Palestinians have received on an annual basis from the entire international community was less than 1 million if you take the entire period.
1 billion.
$1 billion. So if they have access to $5 billion brought into their economy, that certainly would significantly improve the economic conditions and make the Palestinian state economically viable. Disarming Hamas does not go, of course, it is not going to be easy to disarm Hamas. One reason the Palestinian Authority failed to disarm Hamas, as I indicated earlier, is that Oslo did not promise a Palestinian state. Arafat could, unlike Ben Gurion, the example that Shai gave, Ben Gurion already had a state, declared a state. The state was in existence when Ben Gurion decided that he will resort to violence against those who wanted their own militia. This will be the first time that the Palestinians will reach an agreement with Israel on a two-state solution, whereby steps would be taken towards creating a Palestinian state. Yes, that could still fail, and Hamas might resist being disarmed. However, Hamas is actually on the record now indicating that if there is a Palestinian state, Hamas would be willing to disarm. So it is not something that today Hamas is putting as an impediment to reaching an agreement. Hamas was excluded from the negotiating process on Oslo. There is absolutely no doubt about that. And there is absolutely no chance that Hamas would have ever agreed to the Oslo agreement given the terms. Again, Hamas probably would not have agreed to a two-state solution as well. Nonetheless, Hamas has declared that if the Palestinian people supported a two-state solution, Hamas, while it would not support it, would implement that solution if it was to win elections after that. So despite the fact that Hamas, therefore, didn't really like this idea of a two-state solution, it was willing to defer to the majority of the Palestinian public. If the majority was willing to support it, Hamas is on the record supporting that. That gives us enough room for this kind of trade-off, a two-state solution at the table agreed to by Palestinians and Israelis, allowing conditions that would make it possible to disarm Hamas. The reason, there was a question about why is the only choice is to hand over the keys to Hamas. I might have misunderstood that question. The reason we are talking about this is because when October the 7th occurred and the war on Gaza started, Hamas was in control. Nobody else was in control. Israel, during the last 15 months, have failed to eradicate Hamas, to destroy Hamas's military capacity, and to destroy its capacity to govern. Hamas remains, therefore, as a security threat, as a major military asset, not as strong as it was before, and the only governing authority today in Gaza. An Israeli withdrawal automatically leaves Hamas in charge, leaves Hamas in control. It isn't like Israel handing over the keys. Israel has to pull out as part of the ceasefire agreement by default. That agreement says Hamas stays in control, unless there is an agreement in which Hamas is part of to have a replacement government. What we are proposing is that transitional, non-political or technocratic government.
Can I say something?
Yes, Shai.
Thank you. So, first of all, to your question, the PA is the only address that Israel has. And if there is something that we completely agree on, is that it's the PA, okay? But again, you have to take the entire story of the PA that Khalil laid out. It has to win legitimacy again. There are lots of things that have to happen for the PA to be essentially the partner for Israel for a resolution of this conflict.
Palestinian Authority.
Right, the Palestinian Authority. I won't say that my distinguished colleague said anything that is nonsense. However, I will say that nobody in the Israeli, which is now accused by the government is now accusing the Israeli military of being leftist. Nobody in the Israeli military community, the security community, the Israeli political center, and even center left, nobody believes that Hamas is not a major imperative. Just as, by the way, and I go back to hints that my colleague Abdul Munim said, there are elements in the Israeli political spectrum that are also impediments. Somehow they've accepted certain things and allowed certain things to go, but they continue to be an impediment. They continue even now to sabotage the possibility that, first of all, we will get to the second phase of the ceasefire, and from there that we will get into some accommodation with the Palestinians. They are serious impediments that would have to be dealt with on the Israeli side. But this portrait of the Hamas agreeing to this and agreeing to this and this, nobody in the Israeli center and center left in the security community in Israel believes this. There is no documentation that Israelis give some credibility to, because it's not as if Hamas had this grand Congress and they adopted a series of resolutions and they involve everything that Khalil talked about. It's not nonsense. He didn't say any nonsense. It's just the fact that the Israelis don't buy it.
Can I just say one more thing about what Shai just said?
He always wants the last word, you see?
I'll give you the last word. You can confirm or deny.
Eddie won't give me the last
word. You can confirm or deny what I'm about to say. He and I led a team of Israelis and Palestinians in which we sat with Hamas.
Oh, you see? This is where it starts. We did not sit with Hamas.
See, I was not there.
That's true.
You see, this is where the use of language is very misleading. We sat with certain individuals who were, in fact, who really expressed the view of a certain faction in Hamas. It happened to be that also that faction was led by a certain person who was assassinated by Israel in Tehran in the last few months, Ismail Haniyeh. These people were actually tied to Ismail Haniyeh. So it's not as if they weren't. But Ismail Haniyeh, for example, was not a spokesperson for the military arm of Hamas. And these guys in the military of Hamas, in the last 15 months, they've been the ones...
You responded before I said what I wanted to say.
It doesn't matter. The initial assumption was wrong.
That second track, in which very senior Hamas leaders participated, led to an agreement in which Hamas signed a document. We have a copy. He and I have a copy with Hamas senior leaders' signature, in which they, under certain conditions, they stipulated. This came as a result of extensive negotiations in many locations, including in Jerusalem, but elsewhere, in which Hamas agreed to a two-state, these leaders agreed to a two-state solution. Yes, Shai is right. When that solution was taken to Hamas leaders in Damascus and were asked whether they would support it, they declined to sign it. Nonetheless, the fact that we found very senior Hamas leaders in the West Bank with some support from the leadership in Gaza that was willing to sign on to terms that would lead to a two-state solution, and this is a very long time ago, this is 2006, 2007, indicates that Hamas has been evolving, that its dogmatic positions were somewhat flexible, and that they were willing, at least at one point in which we were directly involved and sitting at the table with them, they were willing to come down to agree, yes, setting their own conditions, but these conditions were not much different. Yes, you.
Last
word
word.
is this. It's not just he didn't talk any nonsense. I actually agree with everything that Khalil just said, because you notice that the language somewhat changed. It's certain people, it's certain Hamas leaders, it's certain, and that they've gone through a process of more moderation and so on and so forth. I completely agree with him.
Okay.
Except we're not there yet.
Okay. I would like to thank our distinguished panelists for an engaging conversation, for modeling intellectual vitality. I can't thank you enough. I can't thank you enough. Rhodes community, Rhodes students, you rock.